Sehr geehrte Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests, I'm very honored and delighted to welcome you to our keynote lecture for this Summer Institute, the Museum in a Digital World, Strategies, Methods, Tools, organized jointly by the University of Continuing Education in Krems and the Belvedere in Vienna. So just to give you a little context of why we are having this keynote lecture today, this Summer Institute that was attended by a number of museums professionals all over Germany, Austria, Switzerland, in Krems and Vienna, got funding from the Getty Foundation in LA, and we could come together here to discuss for 10 days, now almost 2 weeks, issues that are related to digitization of collections, how you make collections accessible, and a lot of related issues. We are approaching the last days tomorrow. We're approaching the last day, and our heads are already kind of swirling. We covered a lot of grounds, started with vocabularies, thesaurus, ontologies, data visualization, linked open data, immersive environments, strategies, you name it. And we will also talk about eye tracking tomorrow. So a lot of ground has been covered, but nevertheless, we are very happy to have an open presentation today, because everything else was kind of workshop-like in a closed environment. And the question was, whom shall we actually invite to the keynote lecture of this event? And it seemed that we are all looking to the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, who is really best known for its commitment to using digital technology to enhance the museum experience. It has been actively involved in several innovative digital initiatives, and to make its extensive collections more accessible to a global audience. So we all hope we can learn quite a bit about the Rijksmuseum and its digital ambitions. And I'm now happy to welcome Saskia Scheltjens from the Rijksmuseum, who is actually head of research services there and also chief librarian. We kind of agreed that I won't introduce her in detail, because she will talk mostly, I guess, about her work and her challenges at a big museum like the Rijksmuseum. So please join me in welcoming Saskia. The stage is yours now.
Thank you, Christian. I'm going to, yes. Does that look good? So thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you to you and your team from the Research Center at the Belvedere for the invitation, the warm welcome, and the assistance in preparing this presentation, but also the Center for Image Science, led by Professor Viola Ruse from the University of Continuing Education in Krems, the Getty and their Digital Humanities team, and finally all the participants here, but also all the people that are following online, among which I hope are some of my friends and colleagues at home. I was asked to tell you something about information and data in museums, or at least that's the title that I proposed. But first, I think maybe, and that's more or less the overview of what I'm going to talk about. But maybe Christian already said something about the Rijksmuseum. Here are some facts and figures that might be useful. I got the impression that I don't really need to introduce the Rijksmuseum. But it's interesting to know that, and something that we're proud of at the Rijksmuseum, that it's a state-funded public collection since 1800. It was partially privatized in 1995. It has an amount of staff which is quite amazing. I recently learned because of this presentation that currently the museum has about 1,000 people of staff, which is really amazing. I always thought it was 800, which is big enough, but still. The physical collection of the museum comprises of about 1 million objects, but I always also like to state the fact that it has a half million library volumes and 1.5 kilometers of archival records as well, which I consider part of the whole collection. If you look at it public-wise, we always use the figures pre-pandemic because that's the kind of figure that we strive for even after pandemic. 3.9, almost 3 million visitors annually. It's interesting to compare that to the 6.3 million visits that we had right after the pandemic, and the staggering 63 million visitors on social media. But the thing that we're most proud of and most known for, I guess, internationally, is the fact that, and it's also one of the reasons why 8 years ago I decided to come to the Rijksmuseum, was its open data and open access policies and strategies. I also, as a chief librarian, like to point out that the library and the bibliographical data was already open in 2002, which was really early. And the collection combined with the new website in 2003, but slightly sooner, was opened in 2012. And during the pandemic, we opened our bulletin, our academic bulletin, in 2020. I think what a lot of you refer to if you talk about the digital initiatives really found its origin in the decision of the museum to open the physical museum in combination with a new website, which at that time really created a lot of amazement. Mitchell Whitelaw once called it a generous interface as a design where you could relate quite directly to the objects, and which was an inspiration to many museums. It's kind of surreal to talk about this because we are working on a new Rijksstudio. We have been for the last 4 years, and we're about to announce it next year. So you'll find me in a kind of in-between state, doubting how much I can tell. So it's a strange position to be in. Something more about myself. I'm the head of the Department of Research Services, as Christian already told me. And as head of that department, I sit on the museum's leadership team, reporting directly to the general director. And I always have the idea that that's a strong indication of the museum's commitment to the work that we do as the department. And my position might be a bit slightly unusual, as it combines the responsibilities of a chief information officer, a chief data officer, ranging from collection technology infrastructures to data management to information and data services. I was asked to set up this kind of new department in 2016, combining and integrating the National Art Library in the Netherlands, the Rijksmuseum Research Library, into a larger whole, comprising also new responsibilities like research data management, open collection data and policies, and digital strategies, at least the collection part. It's a department that's part of the sector of collections. It consists of 5 departments, each led by a dedicated manager. And in total, it's a team of about 50 wonderful people that I'm very proud of. But this is also me. I listed here some of the things that define the perspective that I look towards the world and that I use while talking about my work. I'm part of a big Western European art institute. And I'm very much aware that that is my experience, and it completely differs from smaller institutions on the outside or the middle of the field. I'm also an information scientist and a manager. I'm definitely not an academic. I'm not a researcher. I'm not a curator. I'm not even an art historian. I look through the lens of information science towards the work that I do. But I'm very much aware that I have to deal with people that have a completely different perspective. I'm also a foreigner. I'm partly Belgian and partly Dutch, which means that in Belgium, I'm called that Dutch woman. And in Flanders, the Dutch-speaking part of Belgium, and in the Netherlands, I'm called that gentle, soft-speaking Flemish lady. It speaks to the fact that I'm very much aware of the fact of being other. Other also in the sense that I'm a woman in a leadership role and working in a technical field that sometimes isn't as easy as it sounds, which makes me a very aware of gendered power roles, for example. I'm very much aware that what I'm telling you and somebody else telling me might differ. I'm also white. I'm also gay. I found my sexual identity outside of the norm. When I look into this room, I often see white people not resembling the society outside, where that's definitely not only the case. These are biases that inform the story that I tell, and it feels slightly uneasy to do this, I can assure you. But I deliberately choose to make them transparent as I can, in the hope to build bridges and start a conversation. This is also part of me. I inhabit different worlds. I tend to define myself only recently as chief librarian, but as a librarian or as somebody working with information and data, I inhabit many professional worlds. My world is library science, museum tech, library tech, semantic web, management, digital humanities, open GLAM worlds, you name it. I gave a presentation at a Semantic Web in Libraries conference in 2019, I think, Forever in Between, where I thematicized the fact that as a profession, we are always in between worlds. I tend to think that's an interesting position, but it defines the way we look and talk about the world. What I tell you plays also in the context of a wealth of meetings that are happening. I listed only the next 3 months of meetings that are directly related to the topics that you are that you are talking about in the Summer Institute. There's the recently, yesterday, ended Semantic Web in Libraries conference in Berlin, which doesn't only deal with libraries, it deals with a lot more, as it should. But I really can recommend what is being said there. It's really interesting. Some of my colleagues will be speaking within a few weeks in Mexico, something that I'm very proud of. They're going to tell some of the efforts that we do on collection IT at the ICOM conference of museum documentation there. There's the Museum Next conference about digital collections that can be followed virtually, and that's really excellent. There's in The Hague the Europeana Tech meeting for people that are more technically inclined, and so on, and so on. There's a Fantastic Future conference in Vancouver, working with AI in libraries, archives, and museums. And that's only this 3 months. I happen to know, and like some people that are in Vienna, the Vienna-based Museum Leadership's House, who are hosting a closed and very exclusive meeting with leaders in our field in Nice this weekend. And then I even forget the fact that there's a Digital Humanities Conference in Graz, and a really interesting pre-conference that was held by the Intavia project about smashing the silos, the future of digital heritage, of cultural heritage, information and visualization, also in Graz. It's a lot. It was deliberate. The quote refers to a beautiful poem by Walt Whitman, but also is a nod to a colleague of mine who's really fond of Bob Dylan. But how do you catch all this information? How do you absorb all this information? How do you deal with the fact that I gave you so much information and data about myself? What are you going to do with this? How do you remember me? How do you archive me? And not let technology define me to one single image. This is the Google Arts and Culture, where you could compare your own image to an image from the collection. I was kind of disappointed, I must say. But this is actually what I wanted to talk about. Oh, it does it again. It kind of stresses the point that I'm trying to make. It's really urgent. But I kind of don't know how to circumvent this. But digital is not the issue. Information and data are. And I'll move on to the next slide. My point is that there's a lot of talk about digital. And it's really interesting. And I have been working in the field for 20 years plus. But I am more and more coming to the awareness that digital isn't the issue. And what is at its core is something that we need to be talking more about, and that's actually information and data. And this is my favorite slide. People online, friends or colleagues that follow me will say, oh, that slide again. It's my favorite slide that I use to talk about the work that we do in the museum. When I look at a museum, I see this. And deliberately, I see those 3 words, those 3 concepts. And not one, not only data, not only information, not only knowledge, but it's a continuum. And that's my point that I always try to make. You are nothing if you don't approach it as a continuum. There's a lot of talk at the moment about data in digital heritage, in digital humanities, in museums, etc., etc. But it doesn't work if you negate the 2 others. Some people ask me whether I use this with a reference to the DAKY pyramid, which is a known metaphor to talk about the relationships. This is very hierarchical and seems to suggest that wisdom is way more important than data down below. I don't see it that way. I'm a big fan of the cartoonist Tom Gould, who designed it like this, horizontally. It's the relationship between those 2, where data is a raw, unprocessed facts and figures without context, information is the organized and structured and contextualized data, and knowledge is the result of that analysis and the interpretation to uncover patterns. And hopefully, in the end, somebody does something wise with it. But if I talk about this, I get a kind of people staring back at me. What does she mean? Until I show this. And then people get it usually. You know what I'm trying to get at. You're nothing with the eggs and how do you say it? Flour alone. You need to make something with it, and finally you need to eat it. And that's the whole reason why I say this, if it's not hierarchical, which I don't believe, what I sometimes do is explain this slide in a more chronological way. The way I see information and data being approached to in museums, I very much can relate to the 19th century, where the connoisseurship of very often white male curators, which was very exclusive, who share their knowledge, very much relates to the first concept, where the professionalization and standardization of information very much speaks to me if you talk about information, and relates to the 20th century. And the 21st century, there's very much a focus on data. But once again, it doesn't mean anything if you don't see it in relationship to each other. The interesting thing is that this whole continuum moved to a next level with the start of the internet and the whole networked approach to information, data, and knowledge. I very often refer to those two books where Manuel Castells wrote about a networked society in a more philosophical and sociological way. But Lorcan Dempsey was head of research of OCLC, one of the biggest, or the biggest library consortiums in the world. And he packed his blog posts, I think, and published them in a paper printed book called The Network Reshapes the Library. I very often tend to think it also reshapes GLAMS. And I think the whole next level that we're talking about is what the challenge is that you have been talking about for 10 days or 9 days now, which is, I think, in my mind, something more fundamental than only a digital transformation. A digital turn is a broader concept that encompasses the transformation of society and culture due to the influence of digital technology. While digital transformation is a much more practical and narrower concept, primarily about how organizations deal with digital technologies to change their operations and services. Digital transformation sometimes feels like an empty concept to me. You don't stop transforming. I think Chad Weinard, somebody very dear from the US, told that at an MCN conference, and I thought it was absolutely right. You're constantly transforming. So the idea that it can stop is an illusion. But it's a concept that's very often being used also during the pandemic, with the rise and the increased visibility of the importance of digital in museums as a concept to thematize the whole importance of digital. I get it, but it's, you need to keep in mind that it's a broader concept that we're actually talking about. It might be interesting to elaborate a little bit more on the digital strategy from the Rijksmuseum, and I tell you a little bit of a chronological story. where it's interesting to see how that evolved. Why in 2013, with the launch of the new website of the Rijksmuseum, also the new digital, or the first ever digital strategy of the Rijksmuseum was launched. It was linked to the website, the new collection website, Rijksstudio, and also a de facto open data policy. And I call it a de facto open data policy because it wasn't really based on official approval. It was a result of decisions that the web design team did. They had been talking about it quite a lot and a long time, also with curators, etc., etc. But finally it took off because the website took off. And it really focused that first digital strategy on the link from collection to connection. How do we allow people to relate in a really direct way to a collection? That at that time became, we started the whole digitization of the whole of the collection in 2006, and are still working on it and hope to end it by 2025. But this was really where the whole concept of mobile first, for example, was launched. How do you keep that collection make it as personal as possible? Interestingly enough, that evolved. So by 2018, with hindsight, we now realize that what we then started is a second iteration of a digital strategy, where there was a relation about collection, connection, conversion, very much influenced by the then very active and still now very active communication and marketing team, where it was linked to marketing concepts like customer journeys, for example, the rise of social media and the impact of the pandemic. There were a lot of new apps being launched, a stories platform that really was in the verge of readiness when the pandemic hit, which was very fortunate, but also focus on internal data analytics, for example. So that is 2018. Things progress really fast at the Rijksmuseum, I must admit. In 2023, now, we have another digital strategy, although we don't tend to call it that way. I always call it a third iteration. And the interesting thing is that it wasn't initiated by one department or one group of people that they could call the digital people. This is the first integrated, integral strategy relating to the digital in the museum. It was initiated by my department, but also the IT department and the communication and marketing department, where we represent the three sectors of the whole museum, taking into account everything and every requirement and all the wishes that live within the whole institution. I also call it a post-digital strategy, because there's a realization that basically, like John Stack, the director of the Science Museum in London, once said, digital is a dimension of everything. Or Luc Talon, then working at the Met in New York, who said digital is a responsibility of everyone. And I tend to think that's absolutely correct. The interesting thing is that this third iteration is not yet public, but it's agreed upon officially by management in 2022, and we have been working on the new iteration of the website, of an extended open data services, of all kinds of different products that will be launched next year. So that's what I was referring on. And the digital strategy is focusing on all the parts of the Institute. So not only the collection, where open and fair are central, not only on the public, but for example also on the building, on technology, and on the organization. Digital also happens, for example, in HR, where they're working with new systems, trying to engage people and staff. it's also happening in buildings where they have an amazing 4D model where they just film the whole buildings and all the parts of the building that you can't see. Instead of people climbing up a building to check a roof, they have a thing flying over and putting that in a model so that you can see that. You need somebody to manage that as well, etc., etc., etc. Digital is a dimension of everything. That's the reason why I refer to the concept of post-digital, which is a concept by Ross Perry. And I see some people nodding. I don't know whether that is something that was mentioned as well. Yes, I do. So this is a very inspiring, really early 2013 article about the concept of normativity, but also post-digital, where Ross described this as a blurring between digital and non-digital, where it indicates a state in which digital is no longer socially emergent or technologically nascent, near or uprising. And I think that is the best way to describe the position and the state that we're in at the moment, also in the Rijksmuseum. But at the same time, we have this. These are images from the Rijksmuseum where on the left-hand side you see the not. It's a nice building, let's agree. But you've got a combination of a physical space with a physical collection. You've got archival records that have been digitized the last few years at a rapid pace, and you've got the digital collection that we have. This is a kind of hybrid reality that's still also there. This is the image that I usually use when I talk about my department. And I think it aptly describes what we have and what we will have in the next decade to come. But it also, I could use these images, where you see the restoration of the Night Watch on your left, where the previous restorations of the Night Watch, on the first day you would see somebody approaching a painting and starting to work on the object itself right immediately. This time, it's 2 years ago when they started, they scanned and processed the whole thing for a year, creating data before they approached the object themselves. I think that's also the digital transformation and the hybrid situation that we're talking about. But also the public engagement changed, where this picture went viral in The Guardian a few years ago as a kind of symbolism or symbol of youth turning their back to ancient art. Well, the fortunate thing was that what those teenagers were looking at was a new app with information about a Night Watch. People engage differently with physical collections, even more now than when this picture was taken. That's the hybrid reality that we live in, and that's, see, what is that strange? We are now post-digital and hybrid. It adds a dramatic effect to the whole thing, I must admit. So that's the whole picture that I painted. And now I would move on to some of the opportunities and challenges that I see. And I initially wanted to start with this, which is the Gartner Index to Strategic Technology Trends, which is one of the things that CIOs like to use. And there was an interesting blog post from a really interesting blog called Museum, indicating some of those strategies or some of those trends specifically for museums. But after a while I stopped because I think these are too high over. They're interesting and relevant, and that's the reason why they're called trends. But I think it might be interesting to talk about some other things as well. For example, this. I don't know whether you have followed the whole discussion that happened with the ICOM definition, which dragged on endlessly, but which was really, really interesting, I thought, because it initiated the whole discussion about how you have to deal with plurality, with multitude. Is that something that we should be addressing in museums or not? How do we talk with each other about those issues? Talking about conversations and difficult conversations, I don't know whether some of you have followed the whole discussion of the IFLA, which is the International Federation of Library Associations, which had its annual gigantic conference in Rotterdam with about a few thousand librarians all over the world coming to the Netherlands, where there was a huge discussion about some of the values that librarians have, for example. Because the board of IFLA accepted for the next location of the conference, the location in Dubai, accepting the requirement not to talk about LGBTIQ+ themes, thereby not allowing, for example, a discussion with American librarians about some of the challenges that libraries face at the moment that really needs to be talked about. For me, this is a challenge, but also an opportunity. How do we talk? How do we engage in global conversations about values that we not only from a Western standpoint found comfortable to defend? How do you talk when it's really something that touches you at a very personal level? I think there and how we engage as cultural heritage institutions, that's one of the things that we need to talk about. Which are the words that we use? How do we show that whole discussion? More mundane, some of the challenges or some of the opportunities. The opportunities are in black, the challenges are in red. Sustainable IT infrastructures. You have been talking those past days about all kinds of super advanced things. While you return to your institutions, and I don't know all of your institutions, but I guess it's always the same. You talk about advanced things and then you return to your own institutions and you think, how am I going to do this? Where very often you have to deal with isolated, deprecated, siloed systems that are very often not sustainable. Because they're not sustainable, they're very fragile, they break easily, they take a lot of time to update, etc., etc. But the challenge is, if you can take it and make it more sustainable, have a conversation how you take that architecture and review that architecture and make it more sustainable, then you build some of the foundations that you can build on for the next years. One of the discussions that we have internally is the whole conversations about platform IT, where my colleague as head of the IT department tends to think that, or rightly so thinks, that platform IT, infrastructure and IT on the web, software on the web, is really an interesting thing. Well, I sometimes have to remind him that some of those platforms are closed. Some of those platforms and software, so that we lose agency to deal with them. I wore this quote on a t-shirt to some of the meetings where I had to defend a complete overhaul of the collection data architecture of the Rijksmuseum. I succeeded, by the way. But this is all too true. You can't build a house, and a fancy house, on a foundation that's crap. That's old and decrepit. So you need to attack that first, and to do something about that, in order for you to build a fancy new website, for example. This is also a challenge and an opportunity. Linked open data. I know you had a meeting about that as well. We have been hearing that for a long time about all the possibilities, up to a point that some of the people were called evangelists. But there really is merit in the things that we do, and what I think that now we come to a point where some of the things become really a reality not only for the happy few, but it becomes attainable for people in other institutions because it has been taken up by much more institutions. Where we can have a talk about collective data enrichment, for example. Also interdisciplinary heritage data modeling, which seems like a dream 10, 15 years ago. But if I now talk about linked art, for example, some of the people at least know that. Another challenge and an opportunity, data-driven research. I know that there's also the relation with the Krems University, but also, for example, the Getty, where work is being done that's very much at the forefront of what we see here. But it also drives some of the challenges where in an institution you have to find a sweet spot about, shall I go with this technology and is it still in development, or is it stable enough that I can build something and that I can show my director and that it won't break and that it's not solely experimental. There's a growing body of applied research in AI, UX. There's really interesting work being done at distributed search and infrastructure and the Internet of Things, for example. But how do you decide at an institutional level or at a community level how to deal with it, how to go with it? One of the nice things is also there's more and more data. Not only the collection data, but there's new ways of approaching digitized collections. And there are more and more born digital collections that become available. And one of the things that we notice at the Rijksmuseum, for example, is because of the rise of, for example, technical art history, we see also a rise in research data in institutions. I come from a university library, and I actually was quite used of dealing with research data there. But in a museum, that's a completely new territory. How do you support that? How do you manage that? What kind of infrastructure do you need? Can I use some of the infrastructure that universities use, et cetera, et cetera? One of the things that I always try to stress about the fact that it's important to have new data, for example, the digitization of archival records, is that it allows for more new stories that we can tell. What you very often see is there's a new website, but it uses all the old data of all the paintings that have been digitized that we already know. But all the things about textiles, for example, or cups without a famous author or maker, they're still invisible. In order to tell new stories, you need new data. This is also a topic dear to my heart, Open Glam, which is the galleries, archives, museums world. I believe passionately in the power of openness, but I also think that we need to have a conversation about how we were talking about openness, for example, 10 years ago. I have the growing realization that museums are not neutral. This is from an initiative by Mike Murawski and Tanja Laotri. But I realize that neither museums are not neutral, but neither is data or information or technology or digitization. So in order to have a conversation about the importance of openness, I think it's also important to have a conversation about the decolonization of that whole concept. What we unproblematically thought about 10 years ago as something that it was our right to open and share with the world, we now realize that some of those objects are not ours to open. And I think that's a conversation that's still starting and that we need to have as well. I think that's a threat, that's a challenge, but it definitely is also an opportunity to make it more equal. Then open science, open culture, open societies. Those are all big concepts, but they're really, really interesting concepts, especially if you come from, for example, research libraries, open science, and how you share the public research that is being done is something that feels very relevant. And it's interesting to see that in museums, the whole concept of open science really has still started to sink in. But it allows for transparency of data and to have conversations about diversity and inclusion that we otherwise can't. Also another one, a growing information and data awareness. Not only I talking about you, but also growing digital literacy. I think the reason why it's so brilliant that you're here and that I hope that you form a community and that you keep on talking to each other is because I think that growing digital literacy is something that will take us to the next level. But it's also a realization that you come here and you're talking with your peers, and now you have to translate that to your director next week, who might completely not be interested. Or he thinks, well, we're doing digital because I sent someone to that summer institute and now it's check. That's not it. So how do we balance that? And I all suggest you read some beautiful articles that were written. One is by Emily Pugh that has been an inspiration for me for the past years, where she is writing about art history now and institutional change. And one of the things that I found so exhilarating was the fact that she said that information is structured and accessed and has direct influence on how knowledge is produced from it. For people working with information and data, that's an open door. But if you read that as an art historian, it strikes you as lightning if you realize that that's absolutely true. For example, a few years later, Matthew Lincoln, in a really interesting article together with Anne Helmreich and Charles van den Heuvel, wrote about knowledge organization practices underpin all types of art historical research. And also that is absolutely true. And Nancy talked about a really beautiful recent article about art historians of the next generation, some of you, need to be aware of the protocol structures, possibilities, and constraints that undergird the digital environments that we all work in. And I think those are the things that demonstrate and show that there's a growing digital awareness in the field that we work on that is very promising. I have been talking for a long time, so this will be quick. There are some few avenues and projects that I would highlight that I think are interesting. But there are many, many, many more. And those are some of the projects that we have been working on in the Rijksmuseum. But also in the Rijksmuseum, we're working on many, many more projects. So excuse me if this is limited. But one of the interesting things, I talked about the possibilities of data modeling. I think there's the work that's being done by Rob Sanderson, now at Yale, previously at the Getty, about the linked art data model, where some of my team in the Rijksmuseum are working with as well. That is really interesting and promising, and that's worth checking out. Rob also developed, together with a lot of people, the IIIF standard, for example. So he has good references. This is a lab that I know because it's in the Netherlands. So that's my limited view. But I'm very much aware that there are many other labs and similar labs working on the topic of cultural AI. And I think that's the kind of sweet spot where you can find a lot of interesting people that engage and cooperate together at a moment. And it's easily fundable. And then this, that's a project that's close to my heart, and I think some of you might know that as well. It's by the incomparable Thomas Padilla, who's now working at the Internet Archive, but who launched the kind of idea and initiative about an approach of collections as data, exemplify or showing in greater detail how you have to deal with information that is being digitized or born digital, and which are the values that you have to take into account while doing that. There was a Santa Barbara statement in 2017, but only a few weeks ago, there was a Vancouver statement, which I had the honor of cooperating on, which is a kind of second iteration of what you deal with. And what, when I first had that conversation, really stuck to me as something that is really interesting. It's too funny. Information and data make interdisciplinarity and multiplicity possible. That's my conclusion of what I'm trying to tell you. And basically, I have one question and one provocation, and I'm very curious whether this will work as well. Where can we use technology, information, and data to exist in networked realities and multitudes? And I, forever the optimist, say we can. And that's what I wanted to leave you with. If you have, here are the references of all the titles and articles of the people that inspired me to tell the things that I talked about. And let's talk.
Does this already work? Yeah. Thank you, Saskia, for these insights into your work, thoughts, and also for the provocations. So we have some time to discuss some of the issues you brought up, and I have to say that did fit very nicely into what we have discussed over the last couple of days, so I'd assume there will be some questions. Are there some from the room? And those who are online can also just put them into the chat. I will read them out afterwards.
Thank you so much for this inspiring talk. In my opinion, or my belief, museums and building up digital literacy is the most present issue for the next years to come. Do you have some insights how your museum or your institution or your specific field where you're working in brings people together on one table to tackle this, or to build up methods to educate or maybe build up digital literacy for the whole society, when on the other hand a museum maybe becomes a sector with shrinking staff, with these capacities and maybe tools and knowledge to help building up the digital literacy for the society?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I didn't had too much time to prepare for the last part of the presentation, hence that much text and not many images. But one of the images that I could have incorporated is a beautiful image of the Rijkslab, which is an initiative that we have installed and which was very much driven by the IT department, which used to work behind the scenes, but who wanted to have a place where they could test out things and work with, for example, my department, but also other departments. So the Rijkslab is an initiative that is intended internally for Rijksmuseum staff, where they can test things. And I think digital literacy is really, really important. But it's also important not to keep it only theoretical. People have to do things, have to break things, have to build things. And I think that's a mindset that you very often don't find in museums. I don't know how it is with your museum, but I work with a lot of people that are very much focused on the perfect ideal. They would rather die. No, that's too dramatic. But it's the perfection is really sometimes of a curse in museums. And I think one of the reasons why I like, for example, contemporary museums, because they're the kind of experimentational mindset is more there than in sometimes more classical museums. And that's the reason why we established something like that. But I think if you make it broader, one of the interesting things is, for example, editathons, Wikipedians in residence, some of the people that with really simple technology or attainable technology that's, that you can start work with how you do things and see results.
Other questions?
Thanks also from me for this talk. I just have a question about how you question the public or collect responses to different initiatives that the Rijksmuseum has launched. I've heard a lot about social media things that have been very popular. How, well, do you on the one hand survey the audience to say what do you want from us, but also how do you measure maybe with web analytics how things are actually used, both in the sort of popular social media sense and on the scholarly end? Yeah. No, that's a really relevant thing, and there's a lot to be said about that. Of course we measure. I think you can't deal with a communications and marketing department that doesn't measure. They have to prove their worth. So that's some of the things that really started in 2018-19, where there was a real investment in data analytics, where we analyze the digital stuff, but where we also do user surveys of physical visits, etc., etc. One of the things that drove that, for example, was the fact what's the limit of where people are happy in a museum? When it becomes, is the turning point or the shift when people think, well, it's too busy here? The kind of Mona Lisa dilemma, which you can also rephrase as a night watch dilemma, for example. But it resulted in, for example, the Vermeer exhibition, and I don't know if any of you went to Amsterdam for the Vermeer exhibition, but one of the things that we had a new conversation, which was actually data-driven by that kind of research, was the fact that we closely counted and we had numbers about how many people can be in a room before it becomes unpleasant. And really build an exhibition around those principles. And what you sometimes heard was it was busy, but people were civil and moved on and progressed, and it wasn't too busy. So yes, those things are being done. But to the contrary,
I can also give you an example where it doesn't work. When we launched the website in 2012, there was the ability to react and give information on the website about an artwork that was there. You couldn't only download it, you could also add your own information to it. And that was stopped after 1 year. Because one of the things that wasn't thought through is what do we do with all the information that we get from a public? That needs to be reviewed, needs to be assessed, needs to be incorporated in a collection management system or not. Do we have another system then? What do we do with that? And there we decided that doesn't work. If we want to do it, and I would like to do it, definitely. I think openness is a two-way street, not we opening up to you, and you won't be able to say anything back. But then we have to have an infrastructure to allow that and to take it seriously.
On that topic, perhaps a quick question. Yesterday we learned that the digital strategy does not tell you what you actually do, but what you don't do. Is that true? And what is it with the Rijksmuseum that you would never do?
Christian. That's a difficult question. I'm not really sure whether it describes what you shouldn't do, I think a lot of the strategies or vision documents or et cetera, are a sign of their times. And they progress quickly, as you saw at the Rijksmuseum. Whether they're official or non-official, they tell something about the time that we live on and the focus that we have at that moment. I think what I would say mostly is the fact that you need to realize that they're incomplete by definition. And luckily so. I think if there's a strategy that's in stone, you should distrust that quite heavily.
Thank you. I have one question from the chat now, and for you, what role do you think artificial intelligence can play in terms of information and data in museums? There are some museums in Spain developing projects related to AI, such as the Museo del Prado. Do you work with AI at the Rijksmuseum, is the question.
We definitely do, and I think it's interesting and very promising. That's also one of the reasons why I mentioned the Cultural AI Lab and the participation that we have with universities in the Netherlands. But I also think it's important not to be naive. What I very often encounter is every week I get products being promoted to me as if it's the big final solution to everything. You don't have a lot of people to catalog and register the collection. Just run it through AI and everything will be solved. That is not a question, and that's naive. I think it offers opportunities, and that's one of the reasons why I ended with a whole idea. I think technology really is an interesting tool, but it's something that that needs to be made more transparent than it sometimes now is. Because otherwise you have the danger of persisting some of the biases that's in the data that they work with from the beginning. So I think AI is interesting, but I think you need to be critical using it.
Okay, there's been a question right there, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for the really, really wonderful talk. I had a question with regards to, it actually segues on from what you've been saying in a few of your points, that a lot of the initiative projects are, despite their tech focus, very labor intensive in terms of it needs a lot of people actually, whether it is collecting the data, cleaning it, managing it, and then finding information or piecing it all together and finding wisdom from that data. I wondered whether with all of the projects that you've had at the Rijksmuseum, you've had any successes with automation of any of those processes, and where you see potential in that direction, perhaps, or whether you think it's inevitable that all of these projects will always require this high level of resource, because that's also, from a management perspective, something to consider.
I think, yes, there are interesting, information and data is labor intensive, but not more labor intensive than some other works. And then it most of all needs to be taken seriously, in my point, whether it's being automated or not. And I think that was the point that I'm trying to make. I think there's a lot of possibilities also with AI, also with technology, that you can use and that will change some of the work that we do, definitely. One of the challenges is how do you bring staff to use that as well, and how do you change that? That's one of the challenges that we're working on in the museum, for example, where some of the people that used to be documentalists, advising curators about how they had to deal with their documentation, etc., etc., and they're now becoming data stewards, which is something completely different, related but different. How do you bring them to that? And how do you, from the manual work that they were doing, how do you bring them to using some of the digital tools that are available? So these are the challenges that we have as well, yes, of course.
More questions?
I was wondering why you were all grinning when I mentioned Ross.
Yeah, because I think he has a lot of groupies now. He was teaching last week, and it was.
Was he speaking?
He was
you
speaking,
invited him.
and it was a wonderful session. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. He does really good work. So, did he told about the initiatives of in the UK?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah, and we were also talking a lot on this idea of hybridity and how the analog and digital are converging or coming together. But nevertheless, I think I had the feeling that not in every house that's really happening immediately, because it has to do with change management. And you also said that your staff grew tremendously, but in which areas and how do you deal with things that you perhaps just don't have in-house, but skills that you have to develop to precisely get to the point where the digital and the analog are well integrated.
Yeah. I remember when I was here a few years ago in a panel together with Anne and Charles van den Heuvel.
With Peter Körber and Anne Helmreich, yeah.
Yes. And I was interviewed by a local journalist here in the very fabulous Wotruba archive downstairs. It's quiet in the archive, the journalist said. But I was asked there, when will AI arrive? And I had to point out to him that AI is already there. It was in his iPhone lying on the table, for example. And that's very often a response that I give to, for example, a director questioning whether all the technology that I'm so enthusiastic about is still necessary. Do we need all those data, Saskia? Think where to begin. Yes, of course we do, but we have to be smart about it. It's not only the fact that it's a lot, it's the fact that we have tools to manage that and that we can put to practice.
Questions? Otherwise, I think we can actually continue discussing those issues outside with some snacks and some drinks. Sorry that this is not an option for the people who are with us online, but They have to procure their drinks by themselves. Thank you all for being with us tonight, either online or here at the Blickle Kino. And thanks again, Saskia, for your wonderful contribution to the Summer Institute.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.